Preetiji would probably enrich the discussion to follow. Professor Upal Chakrabarti is interested in intellectual history, political economy, agrarian studies, empire and liberalism. He has worked on the connections for his doctoral research, which he finished from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London in 2013. His doctoral work partially focuses on the formation of agrarian property relations in the 19th century Odisha in connection with interregional agrarian governance in British India and political economy in the empire. This work has been published, as we have been informed, and it is definitely a very exciting work that we would look forward to. We have a little bit of time with us, but nonetheless, I have a feeling that given that a lot of enriching discussion is to follow, we might as well begin with his talk right now. So over to Upalji for your talk.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik and Dr. Mishra for introducing my work, my paper rather. Well, this is really an experimental paper for me. I'm totally new to this world of scholarship on Bhakti generally and Bhakti traditions in Orissa. And I'm really thankful to all the organizers, especially Siddharth, for inviting me to this very interesting and again new for me collection of papers on Bhakti in Orissa. So I will start reading the paper, which again, because it's experimental for me and because of COVID restrictions, there was a lot of difficulty in accessing the kinds of archives I would have ideally liked to look into for this paper. Nevertheless, I have put together something which is certainly a developing draft and would benefit from your comments here. Okay. Long ago, as a doctoral student, while looking at cases of settlement of revenue in the villages of Odisha by the East India Company's government in the early decades of the 19th century, I came across a set of reflections on the Kumars or potters of Kumarpada in Puri. The reflections were spurred by the potters' refusal to pay ground rent for their dwellings, which the farmer of the Sattais Hazari Mahal, in which the Moza of Kumarpada was located, had asked for. The potters not only refused this payment, but also stopped their supply of earthen pots to the Jagannath temple, which caused great difficulties for the temple authorities as the Chandan and Snan Yatras were imminent. Looking into the matter, the collector of Puri wrote long letters to the Board of Revenue explaining the old revenue arrangements between the Jagannath temple and the potters, which had been disturbed by the farmers' demand for ground rent from the potters. The collector, C.S. Waring, on the basis of information from the temple Parchas, the Raja of Khurda, and the old revenue records, noted that these potters claimed an exemption from the payment of rent for their lands on, I quote, the condition of their furnishing earthen pots for the use of the temple, unquote, as stipulated in an agreement between them and one of the ancestors of the Raja of Khurda. Waring further observed that although the potters did not actually pay any rent for their land revenue, records showed that their rent, which was a combination of ground rent and an occupational tax, was deducted from the payment which they received from the temple against their supply of pots. The potters were paid in Mahaprasad for their pots, worth a certain amount, out of which their ground rent and occupational tax was deducted. The farmer claiming their ground rent had used these calculations, which took the potters by surprise as they had never paid any rent and perceived their lands to be rent-free. A series of fascinating problems seemed to emerge from this brief and obscure revenue deliberation in the colonial archives, which kept my curiosity alive in it and brought me back to it in this conference on the intellectual history of Bhakti in Orissa. I was struck by both the ease with which the payment in Mahaprasad for the potter's obligation to supply pots for the temple was traditionally calculated in monetary value, and also by the traditional practice of the sale of Mahaprasad by the potters. Both disturbed any assumption of barter or judgmani as the appropriate category to make sense of the temple potters relation. They also made me wonder what kind of item the Mahaprasad was in Odisha, and in what manner can we think about religion and value together for the higher echelons of the religious establishment, namely the temple authorities, as well as a marginal social group like the potters, as they both contributed to a market of Mahaprasad. All of this suggested an array of heterogeneous and contrary ideas and practices, informing one of the greatest entities of Bhakti in Orissa, the Mahaprasad of Puri, which I thought led to a challenging problem in intellectual history. Histories of the Jagannath cult, its popularization, changing dynamics of royal patronage, the temple potters' relation, colonial accounts of the cult and the pilgrimage, and anthropological works on the potters, all threw up interesting possibilities of understanding and reconstructing complex interfaces of diverse ideas about the Mahaprasad. These ideas, in turn, were entangled with other problems, like the colonial project of making sense of Bhakti in Orissa in terms of global and comparative histories of religion in India, the relation between modernity and the Jagannath cult as evident in colonial governance of the religious establishment, the self-perception of the relation between a socially marginal community like the potters and a powerful religious establishment like the Jagannath temple, and of course, the specific formulation of caste in all of this. From Sterling to Hunter to O'Malley, which were the more better-known colonial accounts of Orissa and Jagannath, to the well-known missionary denigration of the Jagannath cult, to more obscure colonial records, Mahaprasad, or the highly revered food of the Lord, served as a field of complex contentions, anxiety, and ambivalence in the project of colonial modernization of India. On the other hand, from the Madala Panjis, or the famous temple chronicles, to canonical pre-modern texts like the Chaitanya Charitamrita, to the Kurala Purana, or the potter's mythical community genealogy, to the more everyday practices of using Mahaprasad in various forms during festivals, pilgrimages, and otherwise, Mahaprasad worked as a highly charged vehicle of community identity, local power, and indigenous markets in Odisha. Obviously, these two fields of operation for Mahaprasad were braided in complex ways, the contours of which the paper attempts to expose more carefully in its longer version. For the time being, I intend to discuss some movements in this field of ideas. Caste featured centrally in British references to the Mahaprasad. In Orissa, its Geography, Statistics, History, Religion, and Antiquities, written in 1822, Andrew Sterling, while fiercely denouncing the, quote, monstrous figures of the cult and their, quote, stupid admiration by the multitude, exclaimed that the same fanciful myths which gave the cult its character endowed the holy food of Jagannath or Mahaprasad with an unusual virtue. Sterling remarked about Mahaprasad, I quote, so great is its virtue that it cannot be polluted by the touch of the very lowest caste, and the leavings even of a dog are to be carefully taken up and used, unquote. Sterling's text made the connection between caste and Mahaprasad, but focused on the latter's divinity and inviolability as its virtue. Mahaprasad was still thought of as an unusual food object in being beyond the divine scheme of pollution due to its divine origin, but very soon its exceptional character would be understood in terms of its ability to dissolve the divine scheme of pollution altogether for the sake of the modern condition of equality. William Hunter's Orissa, in 2 volumes, which were also the second and third volumes of the Annals of Rural Bengal, drills the category of equality into Mahaprasad as the heart of the Jagannath cult. Hunter wrote, I quote, the true source of Jagannath's undying hold upon the Hindu race consists in the fact that he is the god of the people. His apostles penetrate to every hamlet of Hindustan, preaching the sacrament of the holy food, unquote. Hunter declared in discussing the Jagannath cult that, I quote, a history of people in India is a history of their religions, unquote. For Hunter, writing such a history of religions became a project of outlining an evolutionary progressive principle in the changing regimes of religious devotion in India. From Shaivism, which for Hunter was a religion of superstition and fear, to Vaishnavism, which ushered in love and beauty, there was the emergence of an equality principle where all could come close to God. This was manifested in the worship of Jagannath, As here, I quote, the poor outcast learns that there is a city on the far eastern shore in which high and low eat together, unquote. And again, quote, in the presence of the Lord of the world, priest and peasant are equal, unquote. This was particularly visible in the sharing of the Lord's food as, again I quote, the lowest may demand it from or give it to the highest, unquote. Hunter's history of religions joined religion, modernity, and nation, as he christened what he called Vishnuism as the national religion, quote, to then make global comparisons, noting that as in Vaishnavism, quote, the first religious awakenings in modern Europe, unquote, chose its disciples not from priests and nobles, but, quote, from the despised castes, unquote. Discussing Kabir, Ramanand, Chaitanya, comparing the doctrine of the liberation of soul with Quietism in Reformation France and Sufism in India, Hunter presented a tour de force of the historical emergence of equality in India's religion, and therefore in its people. For the people, he said, I quote, Shaivism had enlisted their ignorant terrors. Vishnuism was soon to appeal to the eternal instinct of human liberty and equality. Unquote. From this point, Hunter went into a long commentary on the failure of this promise of equality in the cult of Jagannath. The temple establishment was presented as an enterprise for personal gain. Its charitable purposes were considered to be thoroughly abused, and its greatest vector of equality, the pilgrimage, viewed as a field of greed, corruption, negligence, and hierarchy. The temple, Hunter noted, prohibited several occupational groups from entering into its premises, with a total exclusion of the lowest castes and the right of partial entry to lower ones. The pilgrim guides, who were apostles of equality a few pages earlier, were refigured as hunters, and Mahaprasad, the embodiment of modernity, was cast as the rotten source of death and disease. Jagannath's pilgrimage, which had so far been thought of as the march of modernity and the true Indian national people, march of modernity of the true Indian national people, was called a slaughter, a homicidal enterprise, which, I quote, massacres 6 times more men than Plassey and Waterloo, unquote. Of course, all of this feeds into the aggressive agenda of reform and governance of a disorderly native space that colonial liberalism stood for, in this context, particularly in relation to the government's involvement with public works, sanitation, and public health in Puri. But that apart, what remains interesting for my purposes is the troubling location of Mahaprasad as simultaneously the enabler and destroyer of the modernity of Bhakti. Written roughly during the same time and referring to Hunter's discussion, we find a brief note on a similar anxiety revolving around the use of Mahaprasad in Shambalpur in Captain Sorin Brooke's essay published in the Indian Antiquary. Brooke begins the essay by mentioning that Hunter noted both the Mahaprasad's abilities to dissolve caste and raise large profits from its sale. These virtuous capacities were not maintained in practice, argued Brooke. Like Hunter, he too made comparisons with Christianity and noted the influence of Buddhism on the cult in discussing its potential of equalization. In Shambalpur, however, he observed a gross misuse of Mahaprasad. He noted that there was a widespread local custom of forming trusted and durable ties or engagements between individuals of friendship and business in the name of the Mahaprasad. Ceremonially conducted over an offering of Mahaprasad, these ties, Brooks noted, I quote, appear to have developed into an institution embracing in its effects both private relations and public affairs, unquote. These ties were then used for corrupt ends in government offices, courts, and arenas of business, and rumor said that they were even bought or sold. Comparing this practice with other similar ones like Rakshabandhan, Brooks noted that unlike the latter's, quote, essentially chivalrous spirit, unquote, Mahaprasad ties were utilitarian. A long piece in the Calcutta Review, published in 1848, which reviewed a range of documents on the company's rule in Odisha, including the first book on Puri penned by a native, Brij Kishore Ghosh's History of Puri, expressed similar attitudes of ambivalence towards the Jagannath cult. With usual missionary zeal, the piece disparaged the cult, calling it, I quote, India's greatest monster of iniquity, unquote, the delusive lord of the world, quote unquote, and senseless blocks of wood and stone, quote unquote. It described the pilgrimage as a drama of evil spirits, quoting lines from Shakespeare's Tempest. I quote, hell is empty and all the devils are here, unquote. But like the other texts discussed above, as this essay narrated the history of religion in India in terms of a progressive principle, it noted, I quote, "It is well known that one of the chief doctrines of Buddha was the abolition of caste. In favor of the supposition that the Hindu Vishnu has aught to do with four, which personage we shall assume to be the same as Buddha, it may be cited that the people of many castes at the pagoda of Jagannath mingle and eat together. This peculiarity is said to be in commemoration of Krishna, who always recommended kindness and affection for each other. This advice of the Hindu philosopher is more Buddhistical than Brahminical." Unquote. As elsewhere, the problem of commensality and caste in Jagannath returned to underscore the ambivalent colonial attempts to find a modern frame for writing the history of religion in India as the history of freedom. This essay focused on Buddhism and its influence on the Jagannath cult to find the possibility of freedom and equality in its pilgrimage, and in the Mahaprasad, all the while displaying an attitude of repugnance towards the cult. Mahaprasad was certainly an object of the market, and this was not necessarily conditioned by modernity and British rule. Madala Panji accounts tell us how successive kings expanded the kitchen of Jagannath. If one looks at the most popular legend of the temple's origin, involving the mythical king Indradumna, there too Jagannath wanted to come out of his tribal habitat in order to eat cooked food. More generally, historical works tell us this centrality of food and cooking, with its huge scale and diversity, it did go a long way in popularizing the cult, as the Lord in the form of his food could reach out to an ever-increasing population of devotees. Accordingly, it can be legitimately argued that the market of Mahaprasad had developed quite early in this region. The practice of paying the potters in Mahaprasad and the potters in turn selling it, or Brij Kishore Ghosh's observations that, I quote, "cooks are employed to prepare food for most of the pilgrims at a price which varies according to the demand and is always highest during the festivals," unquote. Or the colonial official Charles Grome's listing of the annual amount realized out of the sale of Mahaprasad in 1805 as 21,178 kahans of cowries, and the various modes of selling Mahaprasad on the 22 steps of the temple and in the Ananda Bazaar. All of this confirms the existence of a deep and varied market of Mahaprasad from a time long before the onset of colonial modernity. Potters, like the temple cooks, formed one of the most significant nodes of this market. The Rajbhoga Itihasa from the Madala Panji records and the Jagannath Sthala Vrattantam, an 18th century Telugu text on the temple servants, meticulously records the history of the royal patronage of the kitchen of Jagannath, the expansion of its items, and the growing establishment of the potters settled by the kings near Puri from the 13th century. An immensely insightful and detailed ethnographic work by Louis Allison Court and Purnachandra Mishra, produced during the Orissa Research Project of the 1970s, remains the only work till date on the temple potters. Court and Mishra's book impressively combines pre-modern sources, ethnographic information, and some colonial records to document different aspects of the potters' lives and their relationship with the temple. Discussions from the book and from the personal collections of potters of some records related to their claims and duties, which are enclosed as appendices to the book, bring out different kinds of conflicts and negotiations between the temple authorities and the potters, which continued till the late 1950s, when finally the roles, duties, and claims of all temple servants were separately codified by an act of the Orissa government. Just as the farmer claimed rent from potters, which I noted at the beginning of the paper, temple parchas, head priests, used to regularly deceive the potters by depriving them of their share of rice and Mahaprasad, demand rent for their lands, and oust them from their lands. The 19th century witnessed regular appeals of the potters to the British government for protection from these harassments, and the government intervened consistently to uphold the rights of the potters to enjoy land free of rent or receive their legitimate dues from the temple. Apart from struggling to receive their dues from the temple, the potters also had conflicts within the community regarding monopolies of supplies and associations formed to regulate such trends. Hunter's text, which mentioned prohibition of temple entry for different kinds of lower castes, noted that potters were granted half right of entry and were disallowed to enter the inner courtyard of the temple. The question of their caste status was, however, worked out by the potters not in particular reference to their rights to enter the temple. The potters had elaborate mythical tales about both the origins of their community generally and about their special relation with the Jagannath temple in this context. These tales circulated orally and were codified in the Kurala Purana and performed in their annual festival of the Kurala Pancham. Apart from the analysis of colonial framings of the relation between Mahaprasad, Bhakti, markets, modernity, and religion in India, this paper also wishes to substantially engage with the self-understandings of their community amongst the temple potters, which I argue revealed different bearings of both caste, market, and religion. The more generic origin myths of the potters brought out a cosmology strongly focused on creation, fertility, and pollution in the community's framing charters. The origin myth presented the birth of the potter as also the birth of a culinary civilization of a different order, marked by the transition from uncooked to cooked food, the latter being possible only with the emergence of pots as the vessel for cooking. Emerging from the sweat of Vishnu's brow, the potters considered themselves, as noted by Kote and Mishra, as agents of creation who gave birth in making vessels out of clay and also performed death by firing the clay pots. These ritual practices of birth and death, which constituted their craft and labor, made them consider pollution as intrinsic to their work. Accordingly, they considered themselves as low in the caste order, but without necessary effects of discrimination, humiliation, or marginalization in the social world. When it came to their relationship with the Jagannath temple, the potters proudly claimed that it is their pots which made the Mahaprasad divine. This claim was not only an assertion of their community's identity into the religious order of the temple, it was further grounded in a complex network of esoteric rituals of the cult itself, revolving around cooking the Lord's food. The pots were rounded at their bottom and faceted in the walls to represent the 108 petals of a lotus, by instruction from the temple to replace the older ritual of drawing lotuses on the ground to keep pots on them in the temple. Temple Brahmins noted that the lotus-like sacred diagram was the Sri Yantra, associated with goddess Lakshmi, which made the pots, I quote, into vessels of female power essential to cooking using the Vaishnavagni mantras. The fire that is ritually renewed in the temple kitchen each morning, then used to light the hundreds of stoves, is called Vaishnavagni or Vishnu's fire, unquote. Many more such characterization of the pots themselves made the potters acutely aware of the continuities between their origin myths and the esoteric world of the Jagannath cult, making their pots and their work central to the production of the divine virtue of Mahaprasad. The particular origin myth of the temple potters of Puri, which narrated their establishment as a community of servants for Jagannath, too talks in the same language of fertility and creation, as a pregnant potter woman is identified as the settler of the community's village near the temple, graced by Jagannath's darshan. The Lord visits this woman out of his abode, as the woman, busy in delivering pots to the temple from a long distance, does not have the time to visit the Lord in his abode. The caste-dissolving and market-enabling qualities of Mahaprasad feature in the potter's self-markings, as well in the colonial officials striving for a modernity of Indian religion. These worlds, however, of Bhakti and its modernity remain different. They are crucially mediated by investments in a market and the colonial legal orderings of exchange relations, but the exchange relations themselves seem to emerge in a past before modernity. Caste remains embedded in this social relation between the temple and the potters. But equality, instead of appearing as rights to eat beyond hierarchy or claim equal rights to enter the divine abode, work as mythically grounded claims of continuity between a lowly caste occupation and the esoteric imagination of creation in the Lord's powerful quarters. These relations between market and caste, or exchange and equality, that produce contrary formulations, not really settling into correspondences with the pre-modern and the modern, informs the inquiries of this paper. I look forward to further explorations of their complexities and possible conversations with the scholarly literature on religion and modernity in India as I develop this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Upalji. Very fascinating, very wonderful work. I must congratulate you for the wonderful research which has been carried out to take this forward. What I would like to say is that I belong to Puri. I'm a native of Puri, and I had n number of contemporary experiences of equalities, inequalities, the various kinds of market strategies that go on, and even the contemporary narratives related to the food, the Mahaprasad, is something which is still equally fascinating, and maybe you can also look into that. But having said that, I believe that it's commendable, it's a wonderful work, and the huge amount of research which has gone into it shows for itself. And we look forward to questions. I'm sure that there will be a lot of exciting questions from many of our participants and speakers. So Preetiji, if you would like to share something, some observations and comments, we can begin with that, and then probably the others would follow.
Utpalji, I was very, very taken with the paper, and I think I worry that I may not have very good questions because I was listening so rapidly. This is a beautiful reading of colonial discussions around the Jagannath cult and the temple and its management, but also how the potters were kind of engaging with different relations of power, but also economic relations, and some kind of carving out a way for themselves, which was both kind of normalizing their exclusion as much as kind of justifying their inclusion. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there. I was wondering if you want to sort of speak a little bit more about what you mean by modernity of Bhakti in this particular paper, whether it's simply about time or there's something else at play, especially if you're thinking about the pre-modern to the modern. What makes this 19th century moment modern for Bhakti itself? Why is that term useful for you in some ways? What work is it doing?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Patnaik, and also thank you, Dr. Mishra, for your comments, and Dr. Mishra for your questions. So should I respond to this first?
Sure. Yeah, while we wait.
Yeah. Okay, so, I have been trying to think, as I did not really, because I was trying to present the material as extensively as possible, I did not really get time to talk about what I mean or think by modernity of Bhakti. But towards the end of the paper, what I have mentioned, just to expand on that a bit, what I find a bit unusual is, well, at one level, I can understand the colonial ambivalence in making sense of pilgrimage and Mahaprasad.
Yes.
While at one level there is the missionary derision, and there is also the general liberal dismissal of the devotional sentiment. At the same time, pilgrimage is a space for creating modern publics, and the colonial government is interested in that, be it in terms of the pilgrimage opening up possibilities for public works, the pilgrimage opening up possibilities for deepened markets, and even if these markets are markets for holy food, which is not really a modern item for the markets, but nevertheless it assumes a commodity form in the market of Orissa. So the colonial government is interested in these modern conditions of a pilgrimage. But at the same time, what I was thinking about is that the fact that these markets of Mahaprasad existed, they were formed and they existed much before the colonial moment. And the potters' exchange with the temple in terms of receiving Mahaprasad for their pots were not really barter relations, because Mahaprasad by that time had already assumed a very valuable status in the market. So the potters received a particular kind of Mahaprasad, the Kotha Bhog, which was again special and was not accessible to the public. And the potters kind of monopolized that beyond the temple to then sell it in the market. So what I see here is the existence of a market of the holy food much before and without the so-called modern conditions of creating a market. So that is something that interests me to understand, that how to therefore make sense of the market of Mahaprasad. Is it a market which is capacitated and created only by colonial conditions, or is it something which is actually created in a very different context and is being, is being responded to by the colonial officials with a touch of ambivalence and anxiety as well? So be it at the level of the sale of the Mahaprasad, or at the level of whether Mahaprasad really dissolves caste, the whole colonial obsession with equality and exchange, which are clearly modern conditions, in this context seem to have pre-modern roots, but not really in the same terms in which the colonial officials would like to see them. So caste, the problem of caste for the potters, also exists much before the colonial officials really make it a point to talk about caste. And this existence, I presume, which I need to figure out in greater detail, the way in which caste exists for the potters is not really part of the conventional narrative of bhakti being a popular form of devotion and it kind of dissolves caste, etc. Because as I see it, that there is a very deep connection between the potter's mythical origin tales and the temple's esoteric rituals. And their sense of pollution is mediated by such, very critical divine conditions of making the pollution productive for the Lord through cooking. So this is again not the way in which, popular participation in bhakti makes caste makes caste dissolve or loosen its grip. So both with regard to caste as well as with regard to market, I want to understand that what kind of roles they have in relation to concepts like equality or freedom, which is a colonial predication. The fact that they should have some relationship with this is a colonial predication. But there seems to be other relations in them for these concepts which are formed beyond the colonial modern moment, before that. So I'm trying to understand, therefore, that how to make sense of this space, how to make sense of the modernity of this space that Bhakti is creating.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question, a couple of questions. So Urmishri is asking if you have looked at the text called Mahaprasad Mahatmya.
No, I haven't looked at so far. I've just glanced through texts more which have a clearer focus on the Mahaprasad texts from the roughly pre-modern period. So be it the Chaitanya Charitamrita, which has discussions on Mahaprasad, or the Jagat Mangal, or the particular text that Dr. Bedamatta is referring to. I have not been able to look at all of them because there are so many references to Mahaprasad in so many texts that, considering all these pre-modern texts, bringing them together will definitely be a big challenge and take up, will require different kinds of skills. But I surely have these in mind. Maybe while I develop this paper, I will look at them. Thank you so much.
There's another question. Siddharth is asking, commenting, but also it poses the question, the potter's access to a saleable commodity is shaped and guaranteed by caste labor, at least in the pre-colonial period. So is that a pre-modern form of labor that we're coming upon in your thinking?
Well, certainly it's a pre-modern form of caste labor, undoubtedly, and it is a unique context because the scale at which cooking is carried out in the Jagannath cult is unparalleled. So therefore, while I was reading on potters, I saw that there are similar potter establishments, for example, for the Lingaraj temple, or similar potter establishments for other temples. But the scale of the potter's establishment in Puri is unparalleled. in India there is no such no such cult or tradition which has cooking so centrally at this scale. So the infrastructure is altogether different for the Puri potters. So while it is a pre-modern form of labor, like all potters' labor, and like maybe all possible such conditions where temples have their servants, different communities, attached to them and settled around them, there are such similar conditions elsewhere as well. But then here, because of the nature of the market, the Mahaprasad market developing and deepening, I guess it has deepened maybe from the 17th century, because what I read in terms of some of the Madala Panji accounts, that the greatest expansion in the Jagannath temple's kitchen happened in the 16th century, when lots of new dishes were added by a particular ruler, and accordingly the temple establishment, the cooking establishment of the temple expanded. So if I take that as the moment from where greater number of potters, greater number of cooks are coming and joining this whole economy, then by the time the British come to Orissa, there's already a 200-year-old market in Mahaprasad, in cooking, in the Lord's food, entrenched in this region. So although it's a pre-modern form of labor, although it's certainly a pre-modern form of caste labor, but at the same time, I think in this particular case, the caste labor is getting mediated by a very dynamic and consistent deep market from quite a long while. So one has to therefore think how to conceptualize labor, caste, and market in this particular context when we are looking at potters and Mahaprasad.
I also wonder whether it also destabilizes the separation between the pre-modern and the modern. The other way of looking at it is to say that actually separation doesn't quite hold.
Yeah, that's what I was suggesting also in the paper, that this it does not really fall into a transition kind of narrative where the markets or the caste question really develops only with modernity, when there are certain modern infrastructures in place, and the market deepens, and the publics are formed which can actually dissolve caste. That's not really what's happening here. With caste, obviously Bhakti has its older, richer history of negotiating, challenging castes from the 16th century onwards. But in this case, the particular form of Potter's engagement, Potter's cosmology with the temple cosmology, maybe makes one think of caste differently, and markets, obviously, which we have discussed.
We have a couple more questions. I'll just note Siddharth's comment again. It's not a question. Also, it is a form of labor that is not in circulation in the sense that it is tied to a certain tempo. So it's not a circulating labor as we understand free labor. And actually building upon that, Professor Danta's question, that it would be good to link this to other supplies to the temple. For instance, the wood to the chariots, the idols, the flowers, and other natural goods, because they have a similar kind of supply structure and specific groups that are kind of clarified as the suppliers for this. So that gives you a broader kind of, have you found anything of that kind yet? Or?
Well, yes. Once again, as I had mentioned, this particular text, Jagannath Sthala Vrittantum, that again, I found references to these texts mostly in Kote and Mishra's work on the temple potters. As I was saying, that I could actually identify several texts which might be useful for this kind of work, but I was not being able to access them because they were either in the Orissa State Archives or in the Heidelberg South Asia Institute collection, which was made basically out of the Orissa Research Project of the 1970s, when all these manuscripts were kind of compiled. So that particular text, the Jagannath Sthala Vrittantum, is actually a long treatise on the different kinds of temple servants. So that outlines in details all the different supplies that are needed by the temple and the different orders of servants that are maintained to provide these supplies, etc. But what remains, it's certainly interesting. If it's possible, one can integrate all these different kinds of supplies in making sense of the temple potter's relation. But what remains important is that the cooks and the potters are the biggest group amongst these servants in the temple. So, and the cooks and the potters therefore share a very close relation also, and there are many conflicts also between them, etc. But they are the two bigger groups of the temple servants. So, yes, yeah, we are running out of time.
Thank you very much, Upalji. Just a quick observation before we move on to the next presentation, because I believe that these very rich discussions can go on, and we will continue these dialogues even outside of this particular framework. That is to say that if you're looking at the Bhakti tradition, in the Odishan Bhakti tradition, especially during the Panchasakha period, I would say that in some sense, although the word I use may not be very appropriate, the Bhakti tradition in some sense disrupted or ruptured the tradition which was going on in the temple. So there is a possibility that the narrative or the discourse around the Mahaprasad and the changes and this narrative of equality, all those things could have emerged at that critical juncture. You could also look into that. That would be fascinating, because you see that prior to that, there might have been a much more hierarchical structure. I know that there was a Buddhist, strong Buddhist influence, but barring this particular aspect of Mahaprasad, probably elsewhere we have a very fairly hierarchical structure. There are two, of course, in the Rath Yatra, you could visit the Lord and you could touch him, but and there were a few others like that, but the caste barrier was nonetheless there, and probably that could have, the Bhakti tradition could have had an influence on that. So you could just explore that. I just thought that I would share it in passing.